Miko, welcome to the show.
Good to be with you guys again. How are you?
I'm doing all right. I am
Good.
so glad that you. I am so glad you could join us because right now there's a lot that is going on in Israel as we speak, especially from the standpoint of protests. Can you give us just a basic explanation of what is taking place in the context of those protests that are going on in Israel right now? What are they protesting, and how long have they been protesting it?
Well, as some people may recall, several months ago, Israel had its third elections in a period of about a year, because the elections were not conclusive. So they had re-elections, went on and on and on. And they re-elected a Benjamin Netanyahu who has been indicted for corruption, who has been the prime minister for over a decade, who everybody knows is corrupt. Yet Israelis, because of the particular political system, which is a parliamentary system, he keeps, he's the best politician. He knows how to negotiate. He knows how to stay in power, and he remains in power. And there's a lot of frustration in Israeli society that he remains in power, even though he is corrupt, even though he's been indicted. Um, but of course, they keep voting for him. In other words, the reality in the Israeli parliament is such that allows him to remain in power, which of course represents to a large degree the will of the people. So it's almost like a schizophrenic society that votes for somebody but then wants to get rid of him, and they can't decide if they love him or hate him. Now the protests want him. Protesters have a whole array of demands, and you have people on the very very left and who demand negotiating with the Palestinians, who demand defunding the police, who demand rights for Palestinians, and then you have people who are further to the right who want nothing to do with the Palestinians and who just want to get rid of him and replace him with somebody else, who is just not as corrupt and has not been indicted. Now, the problem with all of this is that even though it is a popular, almost like an uprising. I mean, they've been protesting by the thousands in the front of the prime minister's residence in Jerusalem for weeks now. But the Palestinians have been excluded. In other words, Palestinians who make up the majority of the population, who are the most disenfranchised, oppressed, enjoy none of the rights that Israeli Jews, the privileged Israeli Jews do, are not part of this. So even if they were to succeed, and even if Netanyahu was to step down, which is highly unlikely, highly, highly unlikely, he's very, very well, knows how to manipulate the system as prime minister. So it's highly unlikely they'll succeed. But even if they did, it would make very little difference in terms of the main issue that plagues the country, which is the lack of rights, the oppression, the occupation of the Palestinians.
So wait, so the protests are specifically because of is it against Netanyahu in this kind of broad sense of the term, this guy's corrupt, we don't want him to be the prime minister of the country? Or is there an element of the protest that deals specifically with the Palestinian rights issue? We don't want this open air ghetto. We need to have something to deal with this. We can't remain to be this intransigent. Or for that matter, um, it is not just morally reprehensible to go through with this annexation plan. Like, I guess I'm trying to get the feel for what is it that on the ground, if you were talking to 1,000 Israelis, what would be the main issues for the reason that they're out there protesting?
They are sick and tired of Netanyahu, but it has very little to depend. Again, if you take a sample of 1,000, you're probably going to find 10 who care about the Palestinian issue, and
I see.
the rest are going to care because he's corrupt, because they don't like his policies in regards to the judiciary. They don't like the fact that he's manipulating the system. They don't like his economic policies and things like that. But the bottom line is that on the Palestinian issue, which again is the most crucial issue, I think, in the country, without which there can be really be no change, no real serious change, is not brought up. And really, Netanyahu, in many ways, is like Trump. He blames the media, he blames the left, he blames radical, elements, left wing elements. that hate him and hate the right and so forth. He blames, kind of like Trump does, blaming all these elements who are instigating and inciting and so on. But the reality is that Israeli society, the Jewish Israeli society, which are the privileged, the ones who have the rights, the ones who are maintaining the oppression against the Palestinians, are sick and tired of him, which is legitimate in its own right, but you cannot. What they're trying to do, and they do this, every few years, Israelis get sick and tired with the government. They go out and they protest. But they're always excluding the Palestinians. Palestinians have always been excluded. And from time to time, you will have a Palestinian personality, a Palestinian politician show up. And then for the next days, the protesters are blamed because they're collaborating with terrorists. Because the very idea of Palestinians showing up means they are collaborating with terrorists, because of course all Palestinians are terrorists. So that's how this thing is playing out. And my prediction is that Netanyahu will be able to, he's going to survive, and eventually the protests are going to get tired and stay home.
Miko, thank you again for joining us. I have a quick question here, kind of back on the subject of Netanyahu. As a figure, you were describing the yo-yoing of public opinion and the weird yo-yoing of the political system, where he was brought up on charges of bribery, significant charges having to do with management of public funds. What do you think set the political situation up for that yo-yoing? Why do you think that's going on? Why has there been this oscillation or vacillation in public opinion? Or do you think that it's merely been a vacillation in his political prospects, that public opinion has been constant, and it's just that he's sort of come under pressure, but then been released from that pressure somehow? What's your view of why that's allowed to take place?
Well, because first of all, he gets elected. I mean, he wins elections. He gets again, the political system in Israel is such that nobody wins 100% of the election. Whichever political party, and it's a multi-party system, whichever political party gets the most votes gets to build a coalition, and the head of that party will become the prime minister. And every single time he's the one who ends up building the coalition and becoming prime minister. Even though a couple of times he came just short of having leading the largest party, he still ended up, because he knows how to manipulate the system, because he's the best horse trader in the business. And really, this is what it's about. At the end of the day, building a coalition is all about horse trading. Everybody else capitulates, and he always ends up on top. So that's the political reality now. To get rid of him, they'd have to get his political party to get rid of him. And his political party doesn't want to get rid of him because he wins elections for them. And he represents in Israel, in Israeli politics, there's really no left. I mean, the left is so marginal that you can count it on the fingers of one hand. In terms of their actual political representation. So you have a very strong right, and you have a very powerful extreme right. So those are the options, right and extreme right. And the right and the extreme right are loyal to him because he wins elections. Now, yes, he's corrupt. Yes, he is. He's in many ways he's like Donald Trump. Although I think if you compare his corruption to Donald Trump's corruption, it pales by comparison. We're talking about the value of his corruption is in terms of dollars, is maybe in hundreds of thousands of dollars. But the point is, everybody knows he's corrupt. Everybody knows that he knows how to manipulate the system, and they still vote for him. So now they're coming out and protesting. Well, what happened when you went to the polls? Where were you when Israel had elections? Why was this not expressed in the elections? As long as he gets the vote, he's going to continue to be in power. And once he's in power, it's really hard to get rid of him because he's very good and he has no conscience.
Miko, we only have a few minutes. We just commenting. We only have a few minutes before we go into the break. But Jamarl, go ahead.
Well, I was going to kind of just making the point that the people in Israel, they don't see that this is their issue, meaning this issue of the Palestinians and the Jews themselves in that particular country, that political conflict where they have this kind of weird separate but equal type system similar to what we had in the United States. They don't see that that's really the crux of their political issue. And so, like you say, you don't have a left in the country because you don't really have anybody who's pushing for Palestinian rights and whatnot. how does a movement like that even grow in Israel? I mean, is it even possible for a movement like that to grow in Israel that deals with the Palestinian question?
I don't think so. No, Israel is a racist, incredibly racist society. I mean, think about the years of Jim Crow. How many whites stood up for black rights? Or think of apartheid South Africa. How many white people stood up for the rights of blacks? There were a few. It's not that they were none. There were a few, but politically they were insignificant. It took a power. It took something from the outside. Now, like you said earlier, 2 million Palestinians living half an hour drive from Tel Aviv are living in the world's largest ghetto, open air prison, without access to water, to food, to medicine, and they're being bombed. They were bombed just 2 nights ago again on a regular basis. The most common sound in the Gaza Strip are the drones that are about to drop bombs. And where are the Israelis? I mean, you're denying 2 million people water. Now, there are Palestinians who live in other parts of the country who are also denied rights, denied water, thrown in jail, being shot and killed on a regular basis. And Israelis are not on the streets. Now, Israelis live across the street from Palestinians everywhere. It's not a very big country. You have Israeli towns that are flourishing, that are doing very well economically, living across the street from townships where Palestinians have no rights, have no jobs, live in utter poverty, in overcrowded conditions. COVID is killing Palestinians worse than any Jewish community, of course, most of the Jewish communities, and nobody cares. They don't like the fact that Netanyahu is corrupt, so they want to change him. But to take that all the way to creating a real democracy with equal rights, and relinquishing their privilege as a part of the apartheid system is not something they're interested in. It's not part of the agenda. It's not what they're calling for. That is the crux of the problem. And to raise that kind of a movement among Israelis, it would be again to try to raise that kind of a movement among whites in the South during Jim Crow.
Sorry, Miko. Yeah, I'm just going to take us into.
No, go ahead.
Break.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're going to take us into a brief break here. We can actually cut all this bit out. I was just sort of signaling the end there. I'm going to give maybe 3-5 seconds of silence here.
Sure.
There we go. Now there's just a clean break. So when they're editing the program afterwards, they'll just have a real clean, quick thing there. Anyway, we're going to be coming back in a second here. I'm just going to bring us back in. Miko, thank you again for joining us. Continuing this conversation, we're talking about the issue of Israel's treatment of Palestine. We're going to turn for a second. We can come back to it too, but we're going to turn for a second to the Democratic Party, the DNC stance on Palestine. When Monday, apparently, I believe this was last week, Monday, the DNC voted to reject additional language that would make the party stance on the Jewish state more critical on this issue of Israel's treatment of Palestine. What's your take on this, Miko?
Well, the Democratic Party has been coward, acting with such cowardice when it comes to this issue that it's disgusting. I mean, it makes you want to throw up. The language that was proposed is it's minimal. It's embarrassing to even talk about this. The state of Israel is an apartheid regime. It is brutal. It is cruel. It is treating Palestinians with the human rights violations of the state of Israel are screaming to the skies. And the Democratic Party, and actually both parties in America, are completely oblivious. Americans don't seem to care about this issue. They're sending billions and billions of dollars and the most devastating weapons to the state of Israel, allowing it to murder and oppress and deny water and deny rights and destroy homes and treat an entire nation with the worst weapons that we can possibly imagine. Not to mention, the detention without arrest without trial, thousands of political prisoners in prison, and they keep treating Israel like it's some kind of a beacon of democracy. I think it's shameful. I think it's grotesque.
When they're talking about it as if it's a beacon of democracy in the Middle East, I always love the way they use the phraseology for that. It's like, yeah, we're a beacon of democracy for the people who have the right to vote, missing the fact that all of these other people who live here don't necessarily have a huge amount of input in the political process. Explain something to me for the moment. As an African American in the United States, I look at what's taking place in Israel, and I can find myself an association or understanding in almost historical terms, at least in the United States, on some level of what's taking place in Israel regarding the Palestinians. I've also have been there and have seen it with my own eyes, where you can see this kind of disparity regarding issues of class, issues of power, where you talk about military power and so forth. Where do they think this ends, though? I mean, if the argument is that we're just going to keep this going to perpetuity, at a certain point, the water for the Palestinians is going to run out. At a certain point, there is no more land to take anymore. And so, if the goal is not a two-state solution, because you've taken so much land that that's not necessarily plausible, then what is the other solution in this? What am I missing here for the end result or the end goal of Israel and, for that matter, the United States?
The end goal was defined very well by Israeli leaders, by Zionist leaders, very early on, after the State of Israel was established in the 1950s. We are here because it is our right to be here. We Israelis are in this country because we have a right to be here. The Palestinians hate us because we took their land. And therefore, we will always have to live by the sword. We're always going to have to make sure that we have the most powerful military force, that if they kill one of us, we kill 1,000 of them. And that's how it's going to be. This is it. We just need to maintain our force, maintain our aggression. We're going to always be the scariest, meanest bully in the neighborhood, so no other country would dare to attack us. Because if they do, we will rain, hell on them, and that's it, and that's how it's been, and that is the vision for the future. Eventually, the Palestinians will die or leave, or they will just surrender. And until then, we have to do what we have to do. Israelis are not suffering. Israeli standard of living is very high. Israelis are quite happy. Of course, now with COVID, things are difficult, but other than that, Israelis live quite well, and they look at the Palestinians, and you have to understand also. I think if anybody can understand this, it's probably blacks in America. The segregation is so effective, and if you've been there, you've seen it. Palestinian towns are literally sometimes across the street from the Israeli colonies and settlements and cities and so forth, where only Jews are allowed to live. And the Jews have plenty of water. The Jewish Israeli towns are prospering. They have water. They have electricity. You wouldn't dream of not having water in the faucet or not having electricity for all your needs. For Palestinians, water is a rarity. For Palestinians, having electricity run on a regular basis is a rarity. For Palestinians, not being pulled over and shot and killed and arrested and having their fathers attacked by the Israeli police and the Israeli military is a rarity. And again, depending on where they live, the severity changes. But the bottom line is there's no place in that country where Palestinians have the same rights and the same privileges as Jews do. So the basic idea, the foundation of the State of Israel is we have no choice, therefore we must continue this. And of course, they're never going to accept us. So this is just how it's going to be. There is no end game. This is the end game. And I'll just add one more thing. As we saw with Jim Crow in the South, as we saw in South Africa with apartheid, basically, because racist ideology always comes with a lack of ability to see the future and with a great deal of stupidity, they fall in the end. And I think Zionism will inevitably fall, and what will take its place, hopefully, will be a real democracy with equal rights.
Miko, thanks again for joining us. We have about 5 or 6 minutes left at this point. I wanted to go into something. We actually talked about this, I believe, last time you were on with us, but I was checking out your website, and I see you have events coming up for this too. This issue of the education system is Israel, in America too, though, but on this issue of the treatment of Palestine. But just broadly, last time we were on, you were talking about an influence that a lot of people don't know. I didn't know that you had been learning about by the Israeli government, but also apparently independent parties, I've heard, on the American education system, also obviously on their own system. Could you talk about that? What are the parallels? What are the contradictions there? What do you see?
Sure. Well, first of all, the panels that we've had 2 panels with experts talking about the influence of the pro-Israeli groups here in the United States on the curriculum in public schools, on social studies curriculum in public schools, so that the way anything in the Middle East is taught is always with a slant which favors Israel. So there's no balance whatsoever. the Palestinians are terrorists, the Muslims are terrorists, Arabs are terrorists, they're always aggressive, they're always attacking, and so on. And the Israelis are always the good guys. That is, I'm generalizing, but that is the slant. And these groups, these pro-Israeli groups, these lobbies here in America are spending, millions of dollars, countless hours, enormous amounts of manpower in order to make sure that every time there's an opportunity to influence the textbooks in public schools, they're there to do the work. There was one case recently in Virginia where the Virginia Coalition for Human Rights actually was there and prevented that from happening. So now there's some movement trying to stop that. The panel that we have coming up next week is going to be talking about how this issue is taught in Israeli textbooks and how the issue of the racism in America is taught in American textbooks. So in other words, we're going to be comparing how Israelis teach their kids in schools, in public schools, about Palestinians and the racism that exists there, and then what is happening here in America in regard to racism against blacks. So that's the comparison that we're going to be making. And if people want to sign up for it, they can go to my blog, tomikopella.com, and sign up for this Zoom conversation. It's going to be fascinating. We've got experts from both, we've got an Israeli, Palestinian, and African-American professors who are going to be discussing these issues. And again, the racism and how it's taught. And sometimes, and actually most times, it's very subtle. Most times it's not blatant racism, but it's done in a very sophisticated and subtle way.
Miko, and maybe this is getting down to probably one of the last few questions, but the people make the argument that when they say, look, either you're talking about a two-person or two-state solution, but that seems difficult at this point because of the amount of land that's been taken and the water and the pockets of land and the way that the land was partitioned, meaning you have these like two isolated areas under control. Or, in what you said earlier, basically a single state where one man, one woman, one vote, meaning one person gets to go out and make their vote, however that turns out. But the argument has always been that that's the destruction of Israel. Either in the case of one person, one vote, where you would get a situation where you may have more Arabs that are voting as opposed to Israelis, which they would say, okay, that's no longer Israel, in which case you've destroyed Israel. I think that's somewhat of a spurless argument, but that's the argument, the way they make it. How do you deal with that as an argument? Meaning, when people make the case that says, look, you're going to destroy Israel if you go with this notion of getting rid of this apartheid state and allowing people to vote. How do you argue against that? And is there an argument there at all? Meaning, is that argument neither here nor there because democracy just matters more? You just have to deal with the consequences of the democratic process.
Well, I would say, first of all, the reason this two-state solution was impossible is because it was never possible to begin with. The state of Israel was never willing, never intended, is not designed in a way that will allow compromise on the land. Because the Zionist ideology, which created the state of Israel, claims that all of the land belongs to the Jews, not to the Israelis, to the Jews all around the world. And the Palestinians are just Arab invaders. So inherently, there was never a chance, there was never a possibility that there could be a two-state solution. It was just talk. There was never any intention or possibility that would ever happen. So let's put that, where that belongs. Now, when apartheid fell, apartheid was destroyed in South Africa. When Jim Crow fell, Jim Crow was destroyed. Israel is just another name for apartheid. Israel is a name for a regime that is an apartheid regime. Now, the word destroy scares everybody because they think of bombs and, nuclear, I don't know what they think, nuclear catastrophe. The destruction of a regime that is an apartheid, brutal, violent regime is not a bad thing. Now, I say, I have friends who are the ultra-Orthodox Jews who oppose the state of Israel because that community has always opposed Zionism for its own reasons. And they have a banner that says, we call for the peaceful dismantlement of the state of Israel. That's what we're talking about. So peaceful dismantlement is better than destruction. But you're right. The bottom line is that when you have a democracy, then the voice of the people needs to speak. And if you believe in democracy, then that's the way it is. And if the majority is Palestinian, and then you can't have a Jewish state. If you want to have a Jewish state in a country with a Palestinian majority, the only way you can do that is through apartheid and violence. And some people think that's okay. I personally think it's abhorrent. I think it should be I can't accept that. I can't recognize. I don't see that as a legitimate claim. So, if we believe in democracy, then yes, we're talking about the peaceful dismantlement, the democratic dismantlement of the apartheid regime, which is called Israel, and replacing it with a democracy with a one person, one vote. Absolutely.
Biko, thank you so much for joining us.
Sure, been a pleasure. Anytime, guys.
Absolutely, this is great. Yeah, we're done here. Yeah, really appreciate you taking the time. This will probably be airing this Thursday, is my guess, but later this week, almost certainly.
All right, sounds good.
Okay, all right. Cheers. Have a good one.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.
All right, guys, this was a success. Excellent. This video is going to be uploaded and it's going to be produced, and we're going to run it on Fault Lines. All right, Shane, good job, man.
Awesome. Same. Yeah, thanks for joining, Jamarl.
All right, guys. All right. I have a little bit more news to do, so stay with us. Like I said, this is going to get produced and this is going to be uploaded later. But I'm going to say like, share, subscribe, and I'll be back in like 3 minutes. Thanks all. Bye-bye.